What if I told you that one of Silicon Valley's most celebrated tech entrepreneurs, a man who graced the cover of a major business magazine, spoke at prestigious tech conferences, and convinced investors to pour over $800 million into his revolutionary companies, never actually existed? Not in the way you think, anyway. This is the story of Marcus Chen. Or rather, the story of how Marcus Chen became the most successful fictional character in American business history. A character so convincing that venture capitalists lined up to invest in his vision. Tech journalists wrote glowing profiles about his genius, and thousands of employees believed they were working for the next great tech visionary. The only problem? Marcus Chen was actually 3 different people, operating the most sophisticated corporate identity theft scheme ever attempted. But before we dive into how this impossible fraud unraveled, let me ask you this. In our digital age, how well do you really know the people you do business with? How much of what you see online can you actually trust? Because after you hear this story, you might never look at a professional networking profile the same way again. Our story begins in 2018, in the heart of Silicon Valley. Tech startups were being valued in the billions, venture capital was flowing like water, and everyone was looking for the next unicorn company. Into this gold rush atmosphere stepped Marcus Chen, a soft-spoken 34-year-old entrepreneur with an impressive backstory. Elite business school MBA, former tech giant engineer, previous exits from 2 successful startups. He had the perfect Silicon Valley pedigree. Marcus claimed to have developed revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithms that could predict market trends with 94% accuracy. His company, Nexus Analytics, promised to transform everything from stock trading to weather forecasting. But Marcus wasn't just selling software. He was selling himself as a visionary. Someone who understood technology in ways that others couldn't. The first red flag should have been how little anyone actually knew about Marcus Chen's personal life. He rarely appeared at industry events. His social media presence was minimal. When he did give interviews, they were usually conducted via video call, with Marcus citing his busy travel schedule and preference for remote communication. In retrospect, these should have been warning signs. But in 2018, everyone was too busy making money to ask too many questions. Marcus's first major coup was securing $50 million in series of funding from one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital firms. The pitch meeting was legendary. Marcus demonstrated his AI system predicting stock movements in real time, with an accuracy that left seasoned investors speechless. Within 6 months, he had raised another $150 million in Series B funding, and Nexus Analytics was valued at $1.2 billion. But here's where the story gets interesting. While Marcus Chen was busy becoming Silicon Valley royalty, 3 very different people were living very different lives across the country. In Boston, there was David Park, a 28-year-old MIT dropout and coding prodigy who had developed genuine breakthrough AI algorithms, but lacked the business acumen to commercialize them. David was brilliant with technology, but terrible with people. He lived alone in a cramped apartment, spending 18 hours a day perfecting code that could genuinely predict market patterns with unprecedented accuracy. In Chicago, there was Rebecca Torres, a 31-year-old former major investment bank analyst who had been blacklisted from Wall Street after blowing the whistle on insider trading at her previous firm. Rebecca understood financial markets better than almost anyone, but her reputation was destroyed. She was working as a freelance consultant, bitter about how her career had been derailed by doing the right thing. And in Austin, Texas, there was Michael Zhang, a 35-year-old actor and master of disguise who had spent a decade doing corporate training videos and had an uncanny ability to become whoever his clients needed him to be. Michael was charismatic, photogenic, and could convincingly play any role. But he was also broke, struggling to pay rent, and tired of playing other people's versions of success. These 3 people had never met. They lived in different cities, moved in different circles, and had completely different skill sets. But they had one thing in common. They were all desperate for a fresh start. And in early 2018, they all received the same mysterious email from someone calling himself the producer. The producer's offer was simple and completely illegal. He had identified a gap in the venture capital ecosystem. Investors were so focused on pattern recognition and previous success that they often invested in people rather than ideas. The producer proposed creating the perfect entrepreneur, someone with the technical brilliance of David, the financial expertise of Rebecca, and the charismatic presentation skills of Michael. Together, they would create Marcus Chen, the ultimate Silicon Valley founder. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. David would develop the actual technology from his apartment in Boston, working under multiple layers of encrypted communication. Rebecca would handle all financial analysis, market research, and investor relations from Chicago, using sophisticated voice modulation software during phone calls. And Michael would be the public face of Marcus Chen, appearing via carefully controlled video calls and the occasional in-person meeting when absolutely necessary. The producer promised each of them $20 million if they could maintain the deception for 2 years. The remaining profits would go to the producer, whose identity none of them knew. They communicated through encrypted channels, used cryptocurrency for payments, and never met in person. It was like a heist movie, except instead of robbing a bank, they were robbing the entire venture capital industry. For over a year, the scheme worked flawlessly. David's AI algorithms were genuinely revolutionary. His code could predict market movements with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Rebecca's financial models were so sophisticated that even veteran Wall Street analysts were impressed. And Michael's portrayal of Marcus Chen was Oscar-worthy. He had studied hours of tech conference presentations, industry interviews, and business school case studies to perfect the persona of a brilliant but humble entrepreneur. Nexus Analytics grew rapidly. The company hired over 200 employees across 3 offices, licensed David's technology to major financial firms, and generated over $100 million in revenue in its first year. Marcus Chen was featured on the cover of a major tech magazine as the AI prophet. He was invited to speak at major industry conferences, though he always declined, citing his preference for focusing on product development over self-promotion. But maintaining a fictional identity at this scale required increasingly elaborate deceptions. Michael had to learn enough about artificial intelligence to convincingly discuss technical concepts. Rebecca had to forge documents, create fake employment histories, and even hire actors to play former colleagues who could vouch for Marcus's background. David had to build actual working software that could fulfill the promises Marcus was making to investors. The first crack in their perfect scheme came from an unexpected source: Marcus Chen's elite business school classmates. Or rather, the lack of them. In late 2019, a tech journalist writing a profile piece on Marcus reached out to the prestigious university's alumni office to connect with his former classmates. The problem was, the school had no record of Marcus Chen ever attending their MBA program. When confronted about this discrepancy, Rebecca, speaking as Marcus's representative, claimed there had been a clerical error in the records. She provided documentation showing that Marcus had attended the university under a different name for privacy reasons, having changed his legal name after graduation due to family issues. The forged documents were convincing enough that the journalist accepted the explanation, but the incident made Rebecca nervous. They were starting to attract too much attention. The second warning sign came when the major venture capital firm wanted to conduct more extensive due diligence before leading Nexus Analytics' Series C funding round. They wanted to visit Marcus's previous companies, interview former colleagues, and verify his track record. Rebecca managed to delay these requests for months, claiming that Marcus's former companies were bound by strict confidentiality agreements and that many of his previous colleagues were now working for competitors. But the most dangerous threat came from David himself. Living in isolation in Boston, spending every waking hour developing AI algorithms, David was beginning to crack under the pressure. He started making mistakes in his code, missing deadlines, and became increasingly paranoid that someone was watching him. The brilliant technology that had made Marcus Chen famous was becoming unreliable just as the company needed it most. The beginning of the end came in March 2020, during the early days of the COVID pandemic. With the stock market in freefall, Nexus Analytics clients were demanding constant updates and predictions from their AI systems. David, working 20-hour days from his apartment, pushed the algorithms beyond their limits. The system began generating wildly inaccurate predictions, losing clients millions of dollars in bad trades. Rebecca, trying to manage investor relations while the company's core technology was failing, became increasingly desperate. She started creating fake performance reports, forging client testimonials, and even hired a voice actor to impersonate one of Nexus Analytics' biggest clients during investor calls. Meanwhile, Michael was struggling to maintain the Marcus Chen persona during video calls with increasingly suspicious venture capitalists. One investor noticed that Marcus seemed to have different mannerisms during different calls. Another pointed out that Marcus's office background appeared to be a green screen effect. The perfect character they had created was starting to fall apart. The producer, sensing that the scheme was unraveling, sent his 3 conspirators a final message. They had 48 hours to extract as much money as possible before disappearing forever. The plan was to liquidate Nexus Analytics' assets, transfer the funds to offshore accounts, and vanish into new identities. But the producer had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated human psychology. After 2 years of living as Marcus Chen, Michael had begun to believe his own performance. He had grown attached to the employees at Nexus Analytics, many of whom genuinely believed they were working for a visionary leader. When the producer ordered him to abandon the company, Michael refused. This is where our story takes its most unexpected turn. Michael made a decision that would shock everyone involved in the scheme. He decided to confess. Not to the FBI, not to the investors, but to Sarah Kim, Nexus Analytics head of operations, and one of the few people who had worked closely enough with Marcus to suspect something was wrong. Sarah was a former top-tier consulting firm consultant who had joined Nexus Analytics because she believed in Marcus Chen's vision. But she had noticed inconsistencies in his behavior, technical knowledge that seemed to come and go, and communication patterns that didn't match someone with his claimed background. When Michael confessed the truth to her, she was devastated, but not entirely surprised. What happened next was unprecedented in corporate fraud history. Instead of immediately calling the authorities, Sarah made her own shocking decision. She offered to help Michael maintain the deception, but only if he agreed to gradually transition the company to legitimate operations. Sarah's plan was brilliant and completely insane. She proposed that Marcus Chen could retire from day-to-day operations due to health issues, allowing Sarah to take over as CEO while gradually transitioning the company's technology to sustainable, legitimate business practices. David's AI algorithms were genuinely valuable. They just needed proper oversight and realistic expectations. For 6 months, this impossible arrangement actually worked. Michael slowly phased out his appearances as Marcus Chen, claiming he was taking a sabbatical for health reasons. Sarah restructured the company, bringing in legitimate technical leadership and implementing proper financial controls. Rebecca, operating from Chicago, helped transition the company's financial operations to standard accounting practices. But Rebecca had her own plans. Unbeknownst to Michael and Sarah, she had been skimming money from Nexus Analytics accounts for months, building her own exit strategy. She had created a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, systematically draining the company's cash reserves while making it look like normal business expenses. The final revelation came when David, the brilliant programmer whose technology had made everything possible, made his own shocking decision. Exhausted by years of isolation and increasingly paranoid about being caught, David decided to sell his AI algorithms to the highest bidder and disappear. He contacted several foreign technology companies, offering to sell Nexus Analytics' core intellectual property for $200 million. What David didn't know was that one of the companies he contacted was actually a front operation run by the FBI's cybercrime division. The Bureau had been investigating suspicious money flows from American tech companies to foreign entities, and David's offer triggered a massive federal investigation. On September 15, 2021, FBI agents simultaneously raided locations in Boston, Chicago, Austin, and San Francisco. David was arrested at his apartment, surrounded by computer equipment and months' worth of empty energy drink cans. Rebecca was taken into custody at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, where she had been meeting with a potential money laundering contact. Michael was arrested at the Nexus Analytics offices, where he had been working with Sarah to legitimize the company's operations. But the biggest shock was yet to come. When FBI investigators analyzed the encrypted communications between the conspirators, they made a discovery that stunned everyone involved in the case. The producer, the mysterious mastermind who had orchestrated the entire scheme, wasn't some criminal genius operating from a foreign country. Today, the Marcus Chen case is studied in business schools as an example of how traditional due diligence methods are inadequate in the digital age. Venture capital firms have implemented new verification procedures, including in-person meetings, background checks with multiple sources, and technology-assisted identity verification. The case also highlighted the psychological power of storytelling in business. Marcus Chen succeeded not just because he promised great technology, but because he embodied a compelling narrative that investors wanted to believe. In an industry obsessed with finding the next great tech visionary, Marcus Chen gave people exactly what they were looking for. Even though he was completely fake, there are still unanswered questions about the Marcus Chen fraud. FBI investigators believe that additional co-conspirators were involved, particularly in creating the sophisticated forged documents and fake online histories that supported Marcus's identity. Bank records suggest that money from the scheme may have been funneled to accounts in countries with strict banking secrecy laws. Most mysteriously, encrypted communications recovered from Dr. Foster's computers suggest that the Marcus Chen experiment may have been just one of several identity manipulation projects she was conducting. References to Project Edison, Project Tesla, and Project Gates were found in her files, but these investigations remain classified. Michael Zhang, David Park, and Rebecca Torres have all been released from prison and are living under new identities. Federal investigators monitor their activities, but none of them have been connected to any new fraudulent schemes. Michael has reportedly returned to acting, though he now only takes roles in legitimate productions. David is working as a programmer for a cybersecurity firm that specializes in fraud detection. Rebecca's current whereabouts and activities are unknown. Dr. Amanda Foster was released from prison in 2024 and now works as a consultant for law enforcement agencies investigating digital identity fraud. Her expertise in psychological manipulation and digital deception has proved valuable in solving other complex fraud cases, though she is prohibited from conducting any independent research without government oversight. The Marcus Chen fraud changed how we think about identity in the digital age. It proved that in our interconnected world, a sufficiently sophisticated lie can become indistinguishable from truth. It showed that our systems for verifying identity and credentials are vulnerable to coordinated deception. And it demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous fraudsters are the ones who believe their own lies. But perhaps most importantly, the Marcus Chen case taught us that in an era of remote work, digital communication, and online relationships, we need to be more skeptical about the people and stories we choose to trust. Because in a world where anyone can be anyone online, the next Marcus Chen might be just a video call away. The next time someone offers you an investment opportunity that seems too good to be true, remember Marcus Chen. Remember that charisma can be performed, credentials can be forged, and sometimes the most convincing stories are the ones that never actually happened. In the digital age, seeing isn't always believing, and believing can cost you everything. The Marcus Chen fraud was more than just a financial crime. It was a mirror held up to our digital society, showing us how easily we can be deceived when we want something to be true badly enough. And in Silicon Valley, where the line between vision and delusion has always been thin, Marcus Chen proved that sometimes there's no line at all. Today, if you search for Marcus Chen online, you'll find news articles about the fraud, legal documents from the trial, and academic papers analyzing the case. But you won't find any trace of the charismatic entrepreneur who once graced magazine covers and inspired hundreds of employees. That Marcus Chen never existed. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. The producer was Dr. Amanda Foster, a 45-year-old professor of behavioral psychology at a major California university, who specialized in studying identity and deception in digital environments. Dr. Foster had created the Marcus Chen scheme not for money, but as the ultimate research project. She wanted to prove her theory that in our digital age, identity had become so fluid that a completely fictional person could achieve real-world success if the deception was sophisticated enough. Dr. Foster had been documenting every aspect of the fraud, planning to publish her findings in a groundbreaking research paper about digital identity manipulation. She had never intended for the scheme to grow as large as it did, and she had certainly never expected her test subjects to generate nearly $1 billion in investment and revenue. The trial of the Marcus Chen conspirators became a media sensation. The case raised fundamental questions about identity, authenticity, and trust in the digital age. How do you prosecute someone for being fake when their fake identity created real value? David's AI algorithms were genuinely revolutionary. The employees at Nexus Analytics had done meaningful work. The investors who had funded Marcus Chen weren't just buying into a person. They were buying into technology and market opportunities that actually existed. David Park was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and attempting to sell technology secrets to foreign entities. His AI algorithms were seized by the government and are now used by various federal agencies for market analysis and economic forecasting. Rebecca Torres received a 12-year sentence for her role in the financial aspects of the fraud. The millions she had skimmed from Nexus Analytics were never fully recovered, leading investigators to believe she had hidden additional assets that have yet to be discovered. Michael Zhang, whose decision to confess had ultimately led to everyone's arrest, received the lightest sentence of 4 years in prison. The judge acknowledged that his attempt to legitimize the company's operations showed some level of remorse, even though it came too late to undo the damage. Dr. Amanda Foster faced the most complex legal challenge. Prosecutors argued that she had orchestrated a massive fraud scheme that cost investors hundreds of millions of dollars. Her defense claimed that she was conducting legitimate academic research and that she had never intended for her experiment to cause financial harm. She was ultimately sentenced to 6 years in prison, and her research findings were sealed as evidence in the case. But perhaps the most tragic victim of the Marcus Chen fraud was Sarah Kim, the head of operations who had tried to help legitimize the company. Despite her efforts to transition Nexus Analytics to legal operations, she was charged as an accessory to fraud. She lost her career, her savings, and her reputation. Sarah was sentenced to 2 years in prison, though she was released after 14 months for cooperation with federal investigators. The 200 employees of Nexus Analytics lost their jobs when the company was dissolved. Many of them had genuinely believed they were working for a revolutionary technology company. Some had turned down other job offers to join Marcus Chen's vision. The psychological impact of learning that their charismatic leader had never existed was devastating for many former employees. The investors who had poured nearly $800 million into Nexus Analytics faced massive losses. While some of the company's assets were recovered and sold, investors ultimately received less than 30 cents on every dollar they had invested. Several smaller venture capital firms were forced to close due to their losses on the Marcus Chen fraud. But the story doesn't end there. In a twist that would have made the producer proud, the technology that David Park developed continues to generate value. The federal government has licensed his AI algorithms to several legitimate companies, and the royalties from these licenses are being used to compensate some of the fraud victims. In a sense, the fictional Marcus Chen's promise of revolutionary AI technology was actually real. It just took the FBI to unlock its true potential.